Our first speaker of this second session is NOAM. She is chair of the Chaim Rosenberg School of Jewish Studies and Archaeology at Tel Aviv University. My introduction will be very short, since you find information on the speakers via the conference website, but I should mention that she recently published a book with Oxford University Press, Shifting Images of the Hasmoneans, and that she is currently working on a new translation and commentary of 4Q MMT for the Oxford Commentary on the Dead Sea Scrolls, for which she received funding from the Israel Science Foundation. We are privileged that she will speak about this very text today. Professor NOAM, we are delighted that you accepted Professor Sievers's invitation, and we look forward to your paper, Farisaic, Halakhah, as emerging from 4Q MMT.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank Professor Sievers and all the team who assisted him for this magnificent event and for inviting me. Thank you very much. When speaking of the Pharisaic image as emerging from the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars usually refer to explicit depictions of the group entitled by the Yachad sect, Dorshei HaChalakot, the seekers after smooth things, or Ephraim. These people, according to the Nahum Pesher, walk about in deceit and falsehood, and with their false teaching, their lying tongue and deceitful lip, they lead many astray. Kings, princes, priests, and people joined with a resident alien. Cities and clans will perish by their counsel. Honored ones and rulers will fall on account of their insolent speech. In the Hosea Pesher, the multitude is accused of listening to those who led them astray, honoring them and dreading them in their blindness, and as if they were divine beings. Similar descriptions of overwhelming Pharisaic influence over the masses, willingness and hypocrisy are well known from Josephus and the New Testament, and even from certain traditions preserved within rabbinic literature. These men, he assured her, had so much influence with their fellow Jews that they could injure those whom they hated and help those to whom they were friendly, for they had the complete confidence of the masses when they spoke harshly of any person, even when they did so out of envy. Antiquities 13. The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, so practice and observe whatever they tell you, but not what they do, for they preach, but do not practice. Notwithstanding this resemblance, there is also a significant difference between the scrolls and the other Second Temple sources. Most works representing Second Temple Jewish society reflect a complex portrait of the Pharisees. Most of the Jews appear to have admired the Pharisees' religious intensity, knowledge of the Torah, and ancestral tradition, but feared their political clout and criticized their manipulative use of power. Thus, Jesus, according to Matthew 23, clearly instructs his addressees to follow the religious guidance of the Pharisees who sit on Moses' seat, in spite of their hypocrisy. And Josephus relates that notwithstanding their guile, the Pharisees had passed on to the people certain regulations handed down by former generations and not recorded in the laws of Moses. The sectarians, in contradistinction, not only denounced the collective character of the Pharisees as human beings, but also considered the Pharisaic teachings smooth things, the Pharisaic speech lying, and their religious guidance leading astray. The main reason the sect provides for its separation from the majority of the people is their opponents' ostensible deviation from the right religious practices. Who were the Pharisees in terms of religious law and practice? How did the schism between them and other Jewish factions come into being? How did their Halakhic religious, rather than political, identity emerge? Were they conservatives or revolutionaries? Did they represent the ongoing linear development of an ancient ancestral tradition, or carry the banner of rebellion and innovation? The Josephine statement that the Pharisees had passed on to the people regulations handed down by former generations and similar attestations in Second Temple literature underlie the prevailing scholarly preconception that Pharisaic law was a conservative system which preserved ancient traditions and objected to religious innovation. For their part, the most radical opponents of Pharisaic law, namely the sectarians, appear to corroborate this impression. Describing the birth of their own movement, they indicate that the founders considered their iniquity and knew that they were guilty men and had been like the blind and like those groping for the way 20 years. But God considered their deeds, and they had sought him with the whole heart. So he raised up for them a teacher of righteousness to guide them in the way of his heart. The path in which the teacher of righteousness guided his congregation is here described as a sharp deviation from the previous religious life, designated as the iniquity of guilty men. This change of heart resulted from some sort of divine revelation. In other words, the birth of the sect was a religious revolution, whereas the Pharisaic culture must have represented an ancient, ongoing tradition. On the other hand, when we examine the rabbinic project, an outgrowth of the probably an outgrowth of the Pharisaic movement, it seems to reflect a novel religious culture, almost completely distinct from the preceding system of Second Temple Jewish law in terms of scope, content, style, and worldviews. Should we consequently consider the option that Pharisaic culture is the product of a revolution that other groups refuse to accept? Different, sometimes contradictory answers have been proposed to these questions. Early on, two leading Wissenschaft des Judentums scholars proposed contradictory reconstructions of the development of Halakhah. Zacharias Frankel thought that rabbinic Halakhah was the direct continuation of and completely loyal to ancient Jewish tradition, and viewed the Sadducees as reformers. For his part, Abraham Geiger thought that the early authentic Halakhah was Sadducean and was later suppressed by a transformative, highly innovative Pharisaic system. A century later, Gedalia Alon suggested that the duality in the Pentateuch itself underlies the distinct Halakhic structures of the Second Temple era. Evidently, one Jewish faction grounded its rules in a certain scriptural outlook, whereas the other chose its counterpart. Following the discovery of 4Q MMT, Yaakov Zussman further observed that the sectarians preferred the priestly ritual stance of Leviticus Numbers, whereas the Pharisees identified with the more popular inclusive law of Deuteronomy. Menachem Kister rejects this approach and contends that the Pharisees adhered to ancient ancestral traditions. This reconstruction, however, must grapple with the fact that the sectarian position is almost always closer to the plain meaning of Scripture. Kister responds that the Pharisaic traditions emanate from early customs, which in fact preceded or paralleled Pentateuchal law, whereas the sect initiated a fundamentalist return to Scripture. A similar viewpoint was later espoused by Adiel Schremer, who stated that one should think of, quote, the Qumran revolution indeed as a reform emphasizing the return to the written text, end quote. In order to resolve this dispute, we should study Pharisaic law through the legislative material itself, rather than from external observations such as those of Josephus and the Damascus document cited above. Because no Pharisaic document has survived, the question is how Pharisaic religious legislation can be recovered. Since the religious law spelled out in the Dead Sea Scrolls is different from the system familiar to us from the later rabbinic literature, and since the latter is commonly considered to be a successor of the Pharisaic Second Temple era legislation, scholars frequently reconstruct Pharisaic law as opposed to what we find in the Qumran scrolls, and as basically very similar to the later rabbinic Halakhah. This line of thought, however, is not devoid of difficulties. As the late Aharon Shemesh has emphasized, the chronological gap between the scrolls and rabbinic literature makes it difficult to determine whether the disparities between Qumran legislation and rabbinic law should be ascribed to an early polemic, posing that the rabbinic system is in fact a reflection of the Pharisaic forerunner, or whether most of the differences should be attributed to the centuries that had passed between the two corpora, the sectarian material thus taken to represent a common Jewish proto-rabbinic system of Halakhah, while the nature of its Pharisaic counterpart remains unknown. 4Q MMT, Miktzat Maasei HaTorah, provides a laboratory for examination of this issue. Unique among the legal works within the Dead Sea Scrolls library, it is a major source not only for sectarian religious law, but also for the views of the opponents of the sect. Phrased as a letter aimed at convincing a political leader of the veracity of the sectarian Halakhic stance, it is comprised of a sequence of polemically formulated legal statements. These religious laws are framed as a group declaration and worded in the first person plural. The legal controversies at the heart of the dispute in 4Q MMT enable recovery of many of the issues fueling the intersectarian controversy of the day. These controversies revolved around such topics as the sacrificial offerings, the red heifer, the sanctity of Jerusalem and the temple and its halachic consequences, purity laws and priestly gifts, etc. The practices criticized by the author of the scroll are among those attested to in rabbinic literature as forming part of the later rabbinic consensus, and sometimes explicitly attributed to the Pharisees, whereas the views espoused by MMT represent stances commonly found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are in certain cases identical to Sadducean or Boethusian positions as described in rabbinic literature. Thus, this scroll is an exceptional case in which we can be certain that each discrepancy between the sectarian legislation contained in it and the rabbinic framework as we know it represents an actual Second Temple controversy rather than a linear development. In other words, the practices criticized in 4Q MMT represent actual contemporary opponents of the sect, most probably the Pharisees. In order to back his assertion that the Pharisaic traditions emanate from early customs, which in fact preceded or paralleled Pentateuchal law, whereas the sect initiated a fundamentalist return to scripture, Kister cites two cases, both also found in 4Q MMT. One is the 364-day septenary year as represented in Enoch, Jubilees, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Kister, Jonathan Bendov, and others proposed that the Pharisaic rabbinic lunisolar calendar preserves the ancient Israelite tradition shared by neighboring cultures in biblical times, whereas the sectarian 364-day year manifests a later schematic and artificial creation dating to the 3rd or 2nd century BCE. Another example is Pharisaic rabbinic insistence that the fourth year fruit mentioned in Leviticus 19 be eaten by the owner rather than given to the priests, as MMT, among other Dead Sea Scrolls and Second Temple works, prescribes. The plain meaning of the verse, that fruit is Kodesh Hilulim Ladonai, holy for giving praise before the Lord, appears to accord with the priestly sectarian rule. However, as Itamar Kislev has beautifully shown, the practice endorsed by the Pharisaic opponents of the sectarians, as cited in MMT, represents an early Canaanite and Israelite custom of a yearly celebration of the first wine, which was drunk by the owner. Faint echoes of this festival are preserved in several biblical narratives, which probably preceded the law formulated in Leviticus 19. Thus, it appears that in these two instances, Pharisaic rabbinic halakha has indeed preserved ancient traditions. However, as for other major questions regarding Second Temple Jewish society, this dispute cannot be resolved by a single generalization. It rather requires careful examination and analysis of intersectarian disputes on a case-by-case basis. Despite the appeal of the sectarian revolution of return to the book, my sense is that in most cases the distance between Pharisaic doctrine and the Pentateuch is the outcome of deliberate transformation rather than ancient pre-scriptural traditions. In the time remaining, I would like to examine two rules found in 4QMMT and elsewhere in the scrolls, which appear to exemplify what I view as the far-reaching change from the ancient law preserved at Qumran to the transformative Pharisaic revolution as I define it. So this is from this very fragmentary and from 4QMMT, and concerning the hides, handles of maybe vessels and hides, and concerning the hide of the carcass of a clean animal, he who carries such a carcass must not touch the purity of. This fragmentary rule probably treats the bringing of animal hides or vessels made from such hides into the temple. Kimon and Sragnel connect this rule to the injunction found in the temple scroll, which you can see on the slide. According to this rule in the temple scroll, it is forbidden to bring into the temple city hides, even of pure animals, even when they have been turned into vessels containing wine or oil, because the status of the animal's skin is the same as that of its flesh. The flesh, in its turn, is prohibited in my city, as the very slaughter of an animal for the sake of non-sacral eating rather than sacrifice is also forbidden there. This sectarian view is totally opposed to rabbinic halakha on three counts. First, the rabbinic system does not recognize any ban on the slaughter of or eating of non-sacral animals. Second, in their regulations, the rabbis apply prohibitions pertaining to the biblical place that God has chosen and to the divine camp to the temple alone, whereas the remainder of Jerusalem is defined as the camp of Israel. Third, even in cases of impure flesh, such as a carcass, rabbinic halakha excludes hides, bones, sinews, horns, and hoofs from this impurity and considers the hide a separate, pure entity. The Pharisees undoubtedly adhered to at least some aspects of these rabbinic conceptions, because 4QMMT, as a polemic treatise, attests to the fact that this was a debated issue. But which of these two halachic stances came first, and which reflects the original Jewish practice, sectarian stringency or Pharisaic leniency? Here, Josephus comes to our aid. In Antiquities 12, he recounts how Antiochus III issued an edict in favor of the Jews, which was published following the Seleucid conquest of Jerusalem in 200 BCE. Nor shall anyone bring into the city the flesh of horses, or of mules, or of wild or tamed asses, or of leopards, foxes, or hares, or in general of any animals forbidden to the Jews. Nor is it lawful to bring in their skins, or even to breed any of these animals in the city. But only the sacrificial animals known to their ancestors and necessary for the propitiation of God shall they be permitted to use. The interdictions cited in this royal edict were apparently formulated in line with the advice of representatives of the Jewish community and were probably grounded in the usual Jewish practice in Jerusalem in that day. This practice is very similar, though not identical, to the sectarian ruling. In this case, then, the stringent Qumran legislation appears to reflect the early tradition, or some kind of early tradition, practiced at the start of the 2nd century BCE, whereas the lenient farisaic position must have been a novelty. Our last test case, the red heifer, is very famous, so widely discussed in the scholarship that it has almost become a cliché. Despite its prominence, I think that its ability to elucidate the development of early Jewish law has been insufficiently noted. It presents a clear route of Halakhic development, one that enables positive identification of which stance is primary and which secondary, and of which party represents ancient tradition and which revolutionary innovation. At issue is the degree of purity required for the participants in the red heifer rituals, as articulated in Numbers 19. Scripture instructs that the red heifer be burnt and its ashes mixed with water to serve as a means of purification for people and objects defiled by corpse impurity. 4QMMT and other Qumran scrolls famously insist on absolute purity for both those taking part in the preparation of the ashes and those using it for purification. He who slaughters it, this is again from 4QMMT, he who slaughters it, and he who burns it, and he who gathers its ashes, and he who sprinkles the water of purification, all of these should be pure at the level of purity achieved following sunset. Thus, priestly circles and the Qumran sectarians demanded the utmost purity for those involved in the ritual, achieved only at sunset following immersion. In contrast, the Pharisees and their successors maintained that the less pure status of Tvul Yom, a person who has already immersed but whose process of purification is incomplete until sunset, was sufficient. On the rabbinic side, the dramatic aspects of the debate are vividly described in the Mishnah and Tosefta. And they would deliberately defile the priest who was to burn the cow on account of the Sadducees, so that they should not say, only by those on whom the sun has set was the cow prepared. The description of the Tosefta is even more definitive. It once happened that a certain Sadducee on whom the sun had set came to burn the cow, and Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai became cognizant of his intention, and he came and placed his 2 hands on him, maybe in order to defile him against his will, and said to him, "My Lord High Priest, how fitting are you to be High Priest? Now go down and immerse 1 time." He went down and immersed and emerged. After he came up, he pulled on his ear. The rabbinic Pharisaic stance in this dispute is striking on several counts, but mainly because it is oxymoronic. The Mishnah dedicates a lengthy description to the meticulous, almost obsessive procedure designed to achieve the utmost purity of the priest designated to burn the red heifer. 7 days before the ritual, the priest is taken from his home and family to a chamber located near the temple. During this period, he uses only stone vessels, which are not susceptible to impurity, and he is sprinkled with the ashes of all the previous red heifers. The water to be sprinkled on the priest about to prepare the red heifer is drawn by young boys born and raised for the sole purpose in a halakhically sterile surroundings. A special causeway is built from the temple to the Mount of Olives, arches upon arches, so as to protect all those that assist the cow from defilement, while marching in the procession from the Temple Mount to the Mount of Olives. In light of this exceptional procedure, the deliberate act of defiling the priest at the very end of the process and then keeping him in a state of partial impurity through the ritual itself is astounding. Thank you. Moreover, this law is oxymoronic, not just in terms of the previous steps taken to ensure the purity of those involved in the ritual, but also in terms of the rabbinic hierarchy of purities itself. The higher the level of purity, the more vulnerable it is to impurity. The red heifer's ashes and the water of purification containing it represent the uppermost degree of purity, above the level required for sacrifices, which in its turn exceeds the purity required for turma, which is heave offering, which is above second tithe, and at the lowest level, pure non-sacred food. Therefore, you can see on the right side, a person or vessel pure enough to eat sacrifices still defiles the water of purification when touching it, unless he specifically purifies himself for handling the latter. One of the disparities between the higher sacrifices, teruma, and lower second tithe, non-sacred food levels of purity is that the former are forbidden to a tevul yom, who has immersed, but the day of immersion has not passed yet, whereas the latter are not defiled or disqualified by his touch. Note the paradox. The noble water of purification is defiled even by the touch of holy and completely pure sacrifices and heave offerings. The latters are in turn defiled by the touch of the partial impurity of Tvul Yom. But this same partial impurity of Tvul Yom is considered sufficient for handling the superior purity of the water of purification. It appears obvious to me that the two opposing tendencies evidenced in rabbinic halakha necessarily represent two distinct phases in the development of the red heifer legislation. The earlier layer, which belonged to the overarching Pharisaic rabbinic hierarchy of purities and shaped the framework of the red heifer legislation at large, was initially shared by all Jewish circles and is therefore also found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, including 4Q MMT. This approach contended that the red cow and its rites require the highest level of purity. The exceptional opposite ruling, which surprisingly reduced the purity requirements for the red heifer below the level required for sacrifices and turma, must have been a later revolutionary Pharisaic step. Further intriguing evidence for this reconstruction has been demonstrated by Menachem Kister. He points at two additional fragments that stress the same sectarian rule as 4Q MMT. And the man who is pure of any impurity, tahor mikol tum'at erev, which lasts until evening, should gather the ashes of the heifer and give them to the priest, etc. A man who is pure of any impurity, tahor mikol tum'ah, asher ya'ariv shimsho, for whom sun has set down. Kister contends that the words a man pure of any impurity are a midrashic inference from the biblical prescription, a pure man, ish tahor, taken to mean entirely pure, namely after sundown. Kister has shown how Tanaitic Midrash used the very same interpretation, but takes it in a different direction. The Midrash starts out with the same homily, pure of any impurity, but then surprisingly in the same breath inverts the message. And which is this? This is Tvul Yom. In other words, the original tenor of the ancient Midrash understood pure of any impurity as requiring perfect impurity achieved only at sundown. The rabbis, however, inverted the conclusion to mean the very opposite, pure of any impurity as designating the partial impurity of Tvul Yom. We thus witness an identical process with regard to both apodictic rulings and exegetical midrash. In both cases, the sectarian legislation represents an early stance which is also preserved in a basic layer of the rabbinic system. This stance demands full purity for those handling the red heifer. In contrast, the Pharisaic attitude regarding the participation of Etvul Yom is clearly a later addition which contradicts former Halakhic structures and earlier Midrashim. To conclude, 4Q MMT supplies clear-cut cases of actual disputes dating to the pre-rabbinic era, where we can consider the nature of Pharisaic legislation in an environment free of post-70 rabbinic developments. Examination of these religious opinions gives rise to different models. In spite of rare instances, like the calendar and the 4th-year fruit, in which the Pharisaic stance preserve what appear to be ancient, pre-Pentateuchal ancestral traditions, in others, like the case of the red heifer, it is evident that Pharisaic rabbinic law is opposed to Jewish practices familiar to us from the Hellenistic period, like the impurity of the hides, or contradicts its own overarching halachic principles. When the rabbinic exegesis also overturns and counters the original message of earlier midrashim, there is then no doubt of its secondary nature. My impression is that in most cases, it was the Pharisees rather than the sectarians who ushered in the halachic revolution. However, general conclusions can only be drawn following careful examination, rule by rule, of the legal cases specified within 4Q MMT. As I'm currently engaged in producing a new edition of 4Q MMT for the Oxford Commentary on the Dead Sea Scrolls, I will have the opportunity to investigate these disputes on an individual basis. Hopefully, this will enable me to further examine my initial impression. Thank you.